We've all watched cruelty unfold before our eyes and wished someone would step in. We've all felt the sting of being judged for who we are rather than what lies within our hearts. In a Viking longhall filled with drunken warriors, a maiden named Brynhild faces mockery and violence because of her size. Everyone watches. No one helps. Then Rurik Oxheart, the most feared warrior in the hall, rises from his seat. Everyone expects him to join the cruelty or ignore it completely. But Rurik surprises everyone. Instead of violence, he chooses something different. Instead of joining the mob, he becomes her protector. His response changes everything in that hall and reveals a painful secret from his past. What made the most ruthless Viking choose compassion over violence? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind howled across the fjord like the breath of angry gods, carrying with it the scent of salt and promise. In the heart of the settlement, Jarl Sindri's long hall stood like a fortress against the elements, its timber walls blackened by countless fires and weathered by decades of harsh winters. Tonight, those walls trembled not from wind, but from the thunderous voices of warriors celebrating their latest victory. The great hall stretched nearly 60 paces from door to high seat, its vaulted ceiling disappearing into shadows where smoke from the central fire pit danced with the light of oil lamps. Carved pillars, each the width of 3 men, supported the roof, their surfaces, telling stories of battles won and heroes fallen. The floor, worn smooth by generations of boots and revelry, bore the stains of spilled mead and the occasional splash of blood from disputes settled in the old way. At the head of the hall, upon a throne carved from the bones of a great whale, sat Jarl Sindri. His grey beard, woven with silver rings, caught the firelight as he raised his drinking horn high. The horn itself was a masterwork carved from the tusk of a walrus he had slain with his own hands in his younger days, its surface decorated with intricate knotwork that seemed to writhe in the dancing flames. "To victory!" Sindra's voice boomed across the hall, and 40 warriors responded in kind, their voices creating a sound like thunder rolling across the mountains. They had reason to celebrate. 3 days past, they had driven the rival clan of Eric Bloodaxe from the disputed fishing grounds, claiming not just territory but honor. The spoils of that victory now filled their bellies and warmed their blood. The feast was magnificent by any measure. Whole roasted boar turned on spits, their skin crackling and fat hissing into the flames below. Tables groaned under the weight of fresh bread, wheels of aged cheese, and barrels of ale that had fermented through the long winter months. The air hung thick with the aroma of meat and smoke, honey, mead, and the tang of pickled fish. Among the warriors sat men whose very names struck fear into their enemies' hearts. There was Bjorn the bear slayer, whose massive frame dwarfed even the largest of his companions. His arms, thick as tree trunks, bore scars from 100 battles, and his laugh could shake dust from the rafters. Beside him sat Gunnar One-Eye, who had lost his left eye to a Saxon blade, but gained a reputation for seeing through deception that few could match. Near the center of the hall, where the firelight cast the strongest glow, sat Olaf the Swift, whose skill with throwing axes was legendary throughout the Northlands. Men said he could split a hair at 20 paces, and none who had faced him in combat lived to dispute the claim. His drinking horn never seemed to empty, yet his hand remained steady as stone. But it was the figure in the shadows, seated apart from the others, who commanded the most attention through his very stillness. Rurik Oxheart sat with his back against one of the great pillars, his massive battle-axe hanging on the wall above his head like a silent promise. The weapon was a thing of terrible beauty, its double-edged head forged from the finest steel, its handle worn smooth by years of use. Runes carved along the blade spoke of victory and death, while the iron spikes that adorned its head had tasted the blood of more men than could be counted. Rurik himself was a study in controlled power. Though not the largest man in the hall, There was something about him that made others instinctively step aside when he moved. His dark hair hung to his shoulders, streaked with premature silver that spoke of the burdens he carried. His eyes, pale as winter ice, missed nothing, yet revealed nothing of the thoughts that moved behind them. The other warriors spoke his name in whispers, even in celebration. They had all heard the stories how he had faced down a dozen Saxon warriors single-handed at the Battle of Crow's Hill, how he had broken the shield wall at Lindisfarne with nothing but his bare hands and his rage. Some claimed he felt no pain, that his heart had been replaced with ice by the gods themselves. Others whispered that he had made a pact with the dark spirits of the sea, trading his capacity for mercy for strength beyond mortal limits. Yet tonight, as the ale flowed and voices grew louder, Rurik remained silent. His drinking horn sat barely touched beside him, while his gaze moved slowly across the hall, taking in every face, every gesture, every subtle shift in the crowd's mood. Those who caught his eye quickly looked away, as if fearing what they might see reflected there. In the far corner of the hall, near the great doors where the cold air leaked in despite the heavy tapestries, the servants moved like shadows among the celebrating warriors. They carried platters of food and pitchers of ale, their movements quick and efficient, their faces carefully neutral. Among them moved Brynhild, a young woman whose presence in the hall was both necessary and unwelcome. She was not beautiful by the standards of her people, this much was clear to all who saw her. Where Viking women were expected to be tall and graceful, she was short and round. Where they were fair, she was dark. Where they commanded attention through beauty or bearing, she seemed to shrink into herself, as if trying to become invisible among the smoke and shadows. Brynhild had come to Jarl Sindra's household 3 winters past, after her father's death in a fishing accident left her with no family and no prospects for marriage. The Jarl, moved by what some called kindness and others called mere practicality, had given her work in his kitchens. She prepared the great feasts, tended the fires, and served the warriors who barely acknowledged her existence. Her hands, roughened by years of hard work, moved with practiced efficiency as she refilled drinking horns and cleared away the bones of consumed meals. She had learned to move quietly, to keep her eyes downcast, to speak only when spoken to. In a world where strength and beauty were the measures of worth, she had found her place in the shadows between. Yet there were moments, brief and quickly hidden, when something else flickered in her dark eyes. Or on the weapons that hung from the walls like promises of glory. There was an intelligence there, a depth of thought that her station did not permit her to express. The other servants accepted her presence with the indifference of those who understood their place in the world's order. They neither befriended nor scorned her, treating her instead with the casual disregard reserved for furniture or tools, useful but unremarkable. It was a lonely existence, but it was existence nonetheless, and in a world where the weak often did not survive the winter, that was no small thing. As the evening progressed and the ale took hold, the mood in the hall grew more raucous. Stories of battle gave way to boasting, and boasting gave way to crude jests. The warriors' voices grew louder, their gestures more expansive, their treatment of the servants more careless. It was at such times that accidents happened, a spilled pitcher here, a rough hand there, words spoken that should have remained unthought. Brynhild had learned to recognize these moments, to sense when the celebration was turning dangerous for those who served rather than celebrated. She moved more carefully now, her movements smaller and more precise, her eyes focused solely on her tasks. Yet, even her caution could not always protect her from the attention of men whose judgment had been clouded by victory and drink. From his place in the shadows, Rurik watched it all unfold with the patience of a hunter waiting for his prey to reveal itself. He saw the way the servants' movements grew more hurried as the night progressed, the way their smiles became more forced, their responses more submissive. He noticed how Brynhild, in particular, seemed to anticipate trouble, her body language speaking of someone who had learned to expect the worst from those around her. Something about her careful movements stirred memories in him that he had worked hard to bury. They were painful memories of another woman who had moved with that same careful fear, who had learned to make herself small in the hope that smallness would keep her safe. But smallness had not saved her, and all of Rurik's strength had not been enough to protect her when it mattered most. The memory brought with it the familiar weight of guilt and rage that he carried everywhere, like armor that could never be removed. It was this weight that had earned him his reputation for ruthlessness, this pain that had driven him to become the kind of man others feared to face. Yet tonight, watching Brynhild move through the hall like a ghost afraid of being noticed, he felt that old wound tear open once more. The feast continued around him, but Rurik's attention had narrowed to a single point of focus. He could sense the gathering storm in the way certain warriors looked at the serving girl, in the cruel laughter that followed her stumbles, in the calculated cruelty that drink often brought to the surface of men's hearts. He had seen this before, in other halls, other celebrations that had turned dark when strength met weakness, with no one to stand between them. Tonight would be different, though he did not yet know why or how. Something in the way the firelight caught Brynhild's dark hair as she bent to serve another table, something in the quiet dignity with which she endured the small humiliations of her station, had awakened something in him that he had thought long dead. For the first time in years, Rurik Oxheart felt moved to action not by rage or calculation, but by something far more dangerous, compassion. The stage was set, the players in their positions, and the night was still young. What would unfold in the hours to come would change not just the fate of a humble serving girl, but the very nature of the man known throughout the Northlands as the most merciless warrior ever to draw breath. The moment came, as such moments always do, when least expected and most feared. Brynhild had been carrying a heavy pitcher of ale toward a table where 3 warriors sat deep in conversation about their latest raid. The ceramic vessel, slick with condensation from the cold ale within, required both hands to manage properly. She approached the table with the careful steps of someone who had learned through painful experience that a single mistake could bring unwanted attention. Magnus the Red, a warrior whose temper matched the color of his hair, sat with his back to her approach. He was regaling his companions with a tale of how he had personally accounted for 6 enemies in the recent battle, his voice growing louder with each retelling. As Brynhild leaned forward to fill his horn, Magnus threw his arm wide in a grand gesture, striking the pitcher and sending its contents cascading across his shoulders and down his back. The hall fell silent as if a spell had been cast over it. Even the crackling of the fire seemed muted in the sudden stillness. Every eye turned toward the table where Magnus sat dripping with ale, his face transforming from surprise to rage in the span of a heartbeat. "You clumsy cow!" Magnus roared, leaping to his feet so violently that his bench toppled backward. His hand went instinctively to his knife, and for a moment the possibility of blood seemed very real. "Look what you've done!" Brynhild stepped back, clutching the now empty pitcher to her chest like a shield. "Forgive me, my lord," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sudden pounding of her own heart. "It was an accident. Your arm—" "My arm?" Magnus advanced on her, his face flushed with drink and outrage. "You dare blame me for your clumsiness? Do you know who I am, girl?" The other warriors at his table exchanged glances, but made no move to intervene. This was Magnus's grievance to settle, and they had no desire to place themselves between an angry man and his target. Around the hall, conversations resumed in hushed tones, but every ear remained tuned to the unfolding drama. "Please," Brynhild said, backing toward the wall as Magnus followed her. "I'll clean it up. I'll bring fresh clothes from your chest. It was truly an accident." "Accident?" Magnus laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "The only accident here is that Jarl Sindri allows creatures like you to serve true warriors. Look at yourself, fat as a breeding sow and twice as clumsy." His words cut through the hall like a blade, and several warriors chuckled in response. The sound seemed to encourage Magnus, who stepped closer to Brynhild until she was pressed against the cold stone wall with nowhere to retreat. "Perhaps," Magnus continued, his voice carrying clearly through the hall, "you need to be taught proper respect for your betters." Brynhild's eyes darted around the hall, seeking help that she knew would not come. The other servants had melted away into the shadows, unwilling to draw attention to themselves. The warriors continued their conversations as if nothing was happening, their studied indifference a clear message that they considered this matter beneath their notice. "I meant no disrespect," Brynhild said, her voice stronger now despite her fear. "I serve this hall faithfully, as I have done these 3 years past." "Faithfully?" Magnus scoffed. "You call dousing a warrior with ale faithful service?" He reached out and grasped her chin roughly, forcing her to meet his gaze. "I think you did it deliberately. I think you thought it would be amusing to humiliate Magnus the Red before his companions." "No," Brynhild said firmly, though her voice trembled. "I would never—" The blow came without warning. Magnus's open hand struck her cheek with a sound like a whip crack that echoed through the suddenly silent hall. Brynhild's head snapped to the side, and she would have fallen if not for the wall behind her. "Mind your tongue when addressing your betters," Magnus snarled. "In fact, perhaps it's time someone taught you that creatures like you speak only when spoken to." He raised his hand again, and this time several other warriors turned to watch openly. There was something in their eyes, not quite approval, but a kind of cruel anticipation that spoke to the darker impulses that strong drink could release in men's hearts. But the second blow never fell. "That's enough." The voice came from the shadows near the great pillar, quiet but carrying clearly through the hall. Every head turned toward the source, and a collective intake of breath swept through the gathered warriors. Rurik Oxheart was rising from his seat, his massive frame unfolding like a force of nature awakening from slumber. Magnus's hand froze in mid-air. His face, already flushed with drink and anger, went pale as he recognized the voice. Around the hall, conversations died completely, leaving only the sound of the crackling fire and the distant howl of wind outside. "This doesn't concern you, Rurik," Magnus said, but his voice had lost its edge. Everyone in the hall knew Rurik's reputation, and even in his cups, Magnus was not fool enough to challenge the most feared warrior in the Northlands directly. Rurik stepped into the firelight, his pale eyes fixed on Magnus with the intensity of a hunter sighting prey. His movement was unhurried but purposeful, each step carrying the weight of absolute certainty. The great axe remained on the wall behind him, but every man present knew that Rurik needed no weapon to be deadly. "I'm making it my concern," Rurik said quietly. His voice held no anger, no threat which somehow made it more terrifying than if he had roared like a berserker. "Release the girl and step away." Magnus's hand dropped to his side, but pride and ale made him resist the obvious wisdom of immediate compliance. "She spilled ale on me," he said, as if this explanation would somehow change Rurik's mind. "She needs to learn respect." "What she needs," Rurik said, moving closer with that same predatory grace, "is for grown men to act like grown men instead of children throwing tantrums." The insult hung in the air like smoke from a burning house. Magnus's face cycled through a dozen expressions: anger, fear, confusion, and finally resignation. He was a skilled warrior in his own right, but he was not suicidal. No one in living memory had successfully challenged Rurik Oxheart and lived to speak of it. "She's just a servant," Magnus said weakly, grasping for some justification that might allow him to save face. "Surely you don't mean to involve yourself in such a petty matter." Rurik was close enough now that Magnus had to tilt his head back to meet his eyes. The difference in their statures was striking not just in height, but in the quality of stillness that surrounded Rurik like an aura. Where Magnus radiated nervous energy and suppressed violence, Rurik simply was, like a mountain or a deep fjord, immovable and eternal. There's nothing petty about how we treat those who cannot defend themselves, Rurik said. It speaks to who we are when no one is watching, when there's no glory to be won or lost. He reached out with one massive hand and grasped Magnus's wrist, not violently, but with the inexorable certainty of a steel trap closing. Magnus winced at the pressure, though Rurik applied no more force than necessary to hold him still. "Look at her," Rurik commanded, his voice still quiet but carrying absolute authority. "Really look at her." Magnus reluctantly turned his gaze to Brynhild, who stood pressed against the wall with her hand covering the red mark his blow had left on her cheek. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears, but her chin was raised in a gesture of defiance that surprised everyone present. "What do you see?" Rurik asked. "I see a clumsy servant who—" "You see a young woman trying to do her work without bothering anyone," Rurik interrupted. "You see someone who gets up before dawn to prepare your food, who tends the fires that keep you warm, who serves you without complaint or expectation of thanks, and you chose to strike her because your pride was wounded by an accident that was as much your fault as hers." The hall had become a tomb of silence. Even Jarl Sindri, seated upon his throne, leaned forward to better hear this unexpected confrontation. This was not the Rurik Oxheart they knew, the cold, merciless killer who showed no emotion and less mercy. This was something else entirely, something that made them question everything they thought they understood about the man. Magnus tried to pull his wrist free, but Rurik's grip held firm. "You're embarrassing me before the entire hall," Magnus hissed. "You embarrassed yourself," Rurik replied. "I'm simply making sure you understand what you did." For a long moment, the two men stood locked in that tableau, Magnus struggling weakly against Rurik's implacable grip, Brynhild watching with wide eyes from the wall, and the entire hall holding its collective breath. Then, with deliberate slowness, Rurik released Magnus's wrist and stepped back. "Apologize," Rurik said simply. "What?" "Apologize to her. Now." Magnus looked around the hall desperately, seeking support or escape, but finding neither. The other warriors avoided his gaze, unwilling to involve themselves in whatever madness had possessed Rurik Oxheart. Jarl Sindri remained silent on his throne, apparently content to let this drama play out without his intervention. "I will not apologize to a servant," Magnus said through gritted teeth. "My honor, your honor." Rurik's voice carried the faintest hint of amusement, which was somehow more chilling than anger would have been. "Tell me, Magnus, tell me, what honor is there in striking someone who cannot strike back? What courage does it require to humiliate someone who has no power to defend herself?" The questions hung in the air like accusations, and Magnus had no answer for them. Around the hall, other warriors shifted uncomfortably, perhaps recognizing their own behavior in Rurik's words. "She spilled ale on me," Magnus repeated weakly, as if saying it again would somehow restore its power as justification. "And you were partly at fault for that," Rurik said, "but even if she had done it deliberately, what then? Is your dignity so fragile that it requires violence to maintain it?" Magnus opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. There was no winning this argument, no escape from the logical trap Rurik had constructed around him. He was trapped not by threats of violence, but by the simple, undeniable truth of his actions. The silence stretched like a bowstring drawn to its breaking point. Magnus stood frozen between his wounded pride and the terrible certainty that challenging Rurik further would end in his destruction. His fists clenched and unclenched at his sides as he searched for words that might salvage some fragment of his dignity. Magnus began, then stopped, his face cycling through emotions like clouds across a stormy sky. The red mark of his blow still blazed on Brynhild's cheek, a visible reminder of his shame. "I may have been hasty in my response." "That's not an apology," Rurik observed, his tone conversational but unyielding. "That's an excuse, dressed in different words." Magnus glanced around the hall once more, but found no allies in the sea of watching faces. Even his drinking companions had distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with his disgrace. The weight of collective judgment pressed down on him like stones upon a drowning man. "Very well," Magnus said through gritted teeth. He turned toward Brynhild, who still pressed herself against the wall as if trying to disappear into the stone itself. "I apologize for striking you. The fault was not entirely yours." The words came out stilted and reluctant, but they were words nonetheless. Brynhild looked from Magnus to Rurik, uncertainty written clearly across her features. In her world, apologies from warriors to servants were as rare as snow in summer, and she seemed unsure how to respond. "Thank you," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I accept your apology, my lord." Rurik nodded slowly, as if weighing the sincerity of both parties. Then he did something that surprised everyone present. He walked to where Brynhild stood and offered her his own drinking horn, still full of untouched ale. "You look like you could use this more than I," he said gently. Brynhild stared at the offered vessel as if it were a serpent that might bite her. Drinking horns were symbols of status in the hall, and for a warrior, especially one of Rurik's reputation, to offer his own horn to a servant was unprecedented. "I couldn't," she said, shaking her head. "It wouldn't be proper." "Proper is overrated," Rurik replied. "Sometimes kindness matters more than custom." After a moment's hesitation, Brynhild reached out with trembling hands and accepted the horn. She took a small sip of the ale, and some of the tension seemed to leave her shoulders. The simple act of drinking from a warrior's horn, even briefly, elevated her status in a way that words could not. Around them, the hall began to stir back to life. Conversations resumed, though in more subdued tones than before. The confrontation had ended without bloodshed, but its effects rippled through the gathered warriors like stones thrown into still water. Magnus retreated to his overturned bench, righting it with more force than necessary. His companions welcomed him back with the false heartiness of men trying to pretend nothing had happened, but the easy camaraderie of earlier was gone. The incident had exposed something ugly in their midst, and the taste of it lingered like bitter wine. From his throne, Jarl Sindri observed the scene with the calculating gaze of a man who had survived decades of political maneuvering. He had not become leader of his people by failing to recognize significant moments when they occurred, and this night had certainly provided one. The Rurik Oxheart who had just defended a serving girl was not the same man who had earned his fearsome reputation through ruthless violence. "Interesting," Sindri murmured to himself, though his words were lost in the general hubbub of resumed celebration. As Brynhild handed the drinking horn back to Rurik, their fingers brushed briefly. The contact was innocent enough, but something in that moment seemed to pass between them, a recognition, perhaps, of kindred spirits who understood what it meant to carry burdens others could not see. "Thank you," Brynhild said, and this time her voice carried more strength. "I won't forget your kindness." Rurik studied her face for a moment, noting the intelligence that flickered in her dark eyes, despite her humble station. "What's your name?" he asked. "Brynhild, my lord." "Just Rurik will do," he said. "I've never been much for ceremony." The simple words carried more weight than either of them realized. By inviting her to use his name without title, Rurik was acknowledging her as a person worthy of basic respect, a revolutionary concept in a world where social hierarchy was enforced as rigidly as law. "I should return to my duties," Brynhild said, glancing toward the kitchen where other servants were beginning to clear the remains of the feast. "Thank you again, Rurik." She moved away with more confidence than she had shown all evening, though she still kept her head appropriately lowered. The other servants watched her approach with a mixture of awe and concern. What had just occurred was so far outside their normal experience that none of them quite knew how to process it. Rurik returned to his place by the pillar, but he did not sit. Instead, he remained standing, his pale eyes moving methodically across the hall. The other warriors felt his gaze like a physical weight, and many found themselves examining their own behavior with uncomfortable scrutiny. Bjorn, the bear slayer, emboldened by drink and perhaps seeking to test the strange mood that had fallen over the hall, called out loudly enough for all to hear, "Well, Rurik, I never knew you had such tender feelings for kitchen girls. Perhaps we should find you a few more to protect?" The jest fell flat in the heavy atmosphere, and Bjorn seemed to realize his mistake even as the words left his lips. Rurik's attention fixed on him with the intensity of a hawk spotting prey, and the massive warrior suddenly found his ale horn utterly fascinating. "Tender feelings have nothing to do with it," Rurik said, his voice carrying clearly through the hall despite its quiet tone. "A man's character is measured by how he treats those who have no power to harm him. By that measure, some of us are found wanting." The rebuke stung precisely because it was delivered without heat or personal animosity. Rurik was simply stating a fact, as one might comment on the weather or the quality of the ale. This somehow made his words more damaging than any angry tirade could have been. Gunnar One Eye, perhaps seeking to lighten the oppressive mood, raised his drinking horn in a toast. "To character, then," he said with forced joviality, "and to the wisdom that comes with experience." A few warriors echoed the toast, but their hearts were clearly not in it. The easy brotherhood of earlier had been replaced by an uncomfortable self-awareness that many found deeply unsettling. As the evening progressed, Rurik remained standing by his pillar, a silent sentinel whose very presence seemed to moderate the behavior of those around him. Warriors who might have normally grown rowdy as the ale flowed found themselves speaking more quietly, treating the servants with unusual courtesy, conducting themselves with a restraint that felt both unnatural and oddly welcome. Brynhild moved through her duties with a new sense of purpose. The red mark on her cheek had begun to fade, but the memory of what had occurred remained vivid. For the first time in her 3 years of service, she had been defended, treated as something more than a piece of furniture with legs. The experience was both exhilarating and terrifying. Exhilarating because it suggested possibilities she had never dared imagine. Terrifying because she knew how precarious her position remained. The other servants watched her with a mixture of envy and concern. They had all suffered similar treatment at various times, and while they were glad to see one of their own defended, they worried about the consequences. Warriors had long memories for slights, and Magnus the Red was not known for his forgiving nature. As the night wore on and the ale barrels grew lighter, groups of warriors began to drift away to their sleeping quarters or their own homes within the settlement. The great celebration was winding down naturally, as such things always did, but tonight felt different. The usual boisterous farewells and promises to continue drinking elsewhere were subdued, replaced by thoughtful silences and meaningful glances. Magnus was among the first to leave, departing with his companions in a sullen cluster that spoke in low voices as they made their way toward the door. As he passed near Rurik's position, his step faltered slightly, but he did not speak or make eye contact. The humiliation of the evening would fester like an infected wound, and everyone present understood that this matter was far from resolved. Brynhild continued her work as the hall gradually emptied, stacking benches and collecting the detritus of celebration. She moved efficiently but without the hunched shoulders and fearful glances that had characterized her earlier behavior. Something fundamental had shifted in her understanding of her place in the world, though she could not yet articulate what that change might mean for her future. The morning sun slanted through the smoke holes in the longhall's roof, casting long shadows across the floor where the remnants of last night's feast lay scattered like the aftermath of a gentle battle. Brynhild moved among the debris with practiced efficiency, but her movements carried a different quality than usual, less furtive, more purposeful, as if something within her had awakened during the dark hours. She had slept poorly, her mind replaying the events of the previous evening until they took on the surreal quality of a dream. The sting of Magnus's blow had faded, but the memory of Rurik's intervention remained vivid as fresh spilled blood. No one had ever stood up for her before. In her world, servants endured and survived, nothing more. As she worked, Brynhild found herself glancing repeatedly toward the spot where Rurik's battle axe hung on the wall. The weapon seemed different now, not merely a tool of war, but a symbol of the complex man who wielded it. She had heard all the stories, of course. Every child in the settlement knew the tales of Rurik Oxheart's legendary brutality, his seemingly inhuman capacity for violence. Yet the man who had defended her bore little resemblance to those fearsome stories. Lost in dreams again, are we? The voice belonged to Astrid, an older woman who oversaw the kitchen servants with the stern efficiency of a ship's captain. She appeared beside Brynhild with the silent step of someone accustomed to moving unnoticed through the world of important men. "Forgive me," Brynhild said quickly, returning her attention to the wooden bowl she was scrubbing. "I was just thinking." "Dangerous habit for our kind," Astrid observed, but her tone held more concern than criticism. "Especially after last night's excitement. The whole settlement is talking about what happened." Brynhild's hands stilled. She had hoped the incident might be forgotten in the cold light of day, dismissed as the kind of minor drama that occasionally flared up during feasts. "Different things, depending on who's doing the talking," Astrid replied, settling down beside her with a grunt of effort. Her weathered hands, scarred by decades of kitchen work, took up their own task of cleaning. The warriors are confused. They can't understand why Rurik involved himself in servant business. Some are calling it a sign of weakness, others a warning to watch their behavior. "And the servants? They're calling you lucky," Astrid said bluntly. "And they're not wrong, but luck has a way of turning sour if you're not careful." The warning in the older woman's voice was unmistakable. Brynhild set down her bowl and looked directly at Astrid for the first time in their conversation. "You think I'm in danger?" "I think you've attracted attention," Astrid replied. "And attention is the last thing any of us want. We survive by being invisible, child. Last night made you very visible indeed." Before Brynhild could respond, the great doors of the hall swung open with a groan of heavy timber. Both women looked up to see Rurik entering alone, his massive frame silhouetted against the morning light. He moved with the same predatory grace she remembered from the night before, but in daylight she could see details that had been hidden by shadow and firelight. He was younger than she had first thought, perhaps 30 summers at most. The premature silver in his dark hair spoke more of burden than age, and there were lines around his pale eyes that suggested he had seen things that weighed heavily on his soul. He wore simple clothes, a wool tunic and leather trousers, but even without armor or weapons, he commanded attention like a force of nature. "You should go," Astrid whispered urgently. "Whatever he wants, it's not for the likes of us." But Brynhild found herself unable to move as Rurik's gaze swept the hall and settled on her. He approached with deliberate steps, neither hurrying nor hesitating, like a man who had made a decision and intended to see it through regardless of consequences. "Brynhild," he said, when he reached speaking distance. His voice held the same quiet authority she remembered, but softer somehow in the empty hall. "My lord," she replied, then caught herself. "Rurik." A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Better. How is your face this morning?" Instinctively, her hand rose to her cheek where Magnus's blow had landed. The skin was tender, but no longer swollen. "It's fine. Thank you for asking." Astrid had faded back into the shadows between the pillars, but Brynhild could feel the older woman's worried gaze upon them. This conversation was unprecedented, dangerous in ways that neither of them could fully understand. "I wanted to speak with you," Rurik said, "about last night." "There's nothing to say," Brynhild replied quickly. "You showed kindness to someone who had none. I'm grateful, but I don't expect." "That's not why I'm here," Rurik interrupted gently. "I'm here because I recognized something in your eyes last night. Something that shouldn't be hidden away in kitchens and shadows." The words hung between them like a bridge. Neither was certain they should cross. Brynhild felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she tried to understand what he meant. "I don't understand," she said finally. Rurik was quiet for a long moment, his pale gaze fixed on something beyond the walls of the hall. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight of old pain that made her want to reach out and offer comfort to this man who needed none. "I had a sister once," he said. "Her name was Sigrid. She was kind, intelligent, full of questions about the world beyond our village. But she was also small and plain, deemed unworthy of protection by those who should have cared for her most." Brynhild's breath caught in her throat. She had not expected such personal revelation from the famously reserved warrior. "What happened to her?" she asked softly. "She died," Rurik said simply, "killed by men who saw her vulnerability as an invitation for cruelty. I was away, raiding with my father's crew, believing that might and glory were the only things that mattered. When I returned, I found her grave and learned how she had suffered while I pursued meaningless victories. The admission hung in the morning air like incense from a funeral pyre." Brynhild understood now why he had intervened the night before, why a man known for his ruthlessness had chosen compassion over indifference. "I'm sorry," she said, meaning it with every fibre of her being. "I swore over her grave that I would never again ignore cruelty, simply because it was convenient to do so." Rurik continued, "That oath has shaped everything I've done since. It's why I fight so hard, why I show no mercy to those who prey on the weak. I thought that was enough, that being a weapon against evil was my penance. But last night, watching you face that drunken fool's anger with such dignity, I realized that sometimes protection isn't enough. Sometimes people need to be lifted up, not just shielded from harm." Brynhild felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. No one had ever spoken to her about dignity or potential. In her world, she simply existed, like a cooking pot or a bucket, useful but unremarkable. "What are you saying?" she whispered. "I'm saying that you deserve better than a life spent trying to be invisible," Rurik replied. "You have intelligence, courage, worth that shouldn't be wasted in obscurity." "I'm a kitchen servant," Brynhild protested. "I have no family, no prospects, no skills beyond cooking and cleaning." "You have more than you know," Rurik said firmly. "Last night, when Magnus was threatening you, I saw defiance in your eyes even through your fear. That takes strength, real strength." The compliment struck her like a physical blow. Strength was not a quality anyone had ever attributed to her, yet hearing it from Rurik, a man whose strength was legendary, made her feel suddenly taller, more substantial. "Even if that were true," she said carefully, "what difference could it make? I am what I am." "You are what circumstances have made you," Rurik corrected. The implication in his words was staggering, but Brynhild dared not hope for too much. Hope was a luxury that people in her position could rarely afford. The days following their morning conversation brought subtle but significant changes to the rhythm of life in Jarl Sindri's hall. Rurik began appearing at times and places where his presence was unexpected during the evening meal, when servants cleared the tables, in the early morning hours when fires were rekindled, at quiet moments when the hall stood empty, except for those who worked to maintain it. He never sought Brynhild out directly, but their paths crossed with increasing frequency. Sometimes he would nod in acknowledgement as she passed with an armload of firewood. Other times he would pause in his conversation with fellow warriors to ensure she could move safely through their circle. Small gestures, but in a world where servants were typically invisible, even small gestures carried enormous weight. Brynhild found herself changing in response to this unexpected attention. The hunched posture she had cultivated as protective camouflage began to straighten. Her steps grew more confident, her voice stronger when addressed directly. It was as if Rurik's recognition of her worth was slowly awakening her to possibilities she had never dared imagine. The other warriors noticed these changes, though they interpreted them through the lens of their own assumptions and prejudices. Some whispered that Rurik had taken the serving girl as a bedmate, explaining his protection in terms they could understand. Others suggested he was growing soft, that years of violence had finally broken something essential in his warrior's spirit. Magnus the Red, harbored darker theories. His humiliation at Rurik's hands had festered like an infected wound, poisoning his thoughts and feeding a resentment that grew stronger with each passing day. He watched Brynhild's growing confidence with bitter eyes, seeing in her transformation a daily reminder of his own shame. "She walks differently now," Magnus muttered to his drinking companions one evening as they sat apart from the main celebration. "Head up, shoulders back, like she thinks herself equal to her betters." Bjorn, the bear slayer, who had learned caution since his own ill-considered jest about Rurik's tender feelings, merely grunted non-committally. He had no desire to involve himself further in whatever strange drama was unfolding between the legendary warrior and the kitchen servant. "Mark my words," Magnus continued, his voice thick with ale and resentment, "this will not end well. Rurik may be feared, but even he cannot overturn the natural order of things. That girl needs to be reminded of her place." From across the hall, Gunnar One Eye caught fragments of Magnus's bitter monologue and felt a chill of premonition. He had fought alongside Rurik in enough battles to know that the man's apparent mercy often masked a strategic mind capable of devastating retaliation. If Magnus was foolish enough to test Rurik's protection again, the consequences would likely be severe. Meanwhile, in the women's quarters where the female servants slept, Brynhild faced challenges of a different sort. Her fellow workers watched her transformation with a mixture of envy and concern that grew more pronounced each day. "You're playing with fire," warned Helga, a grey-haired woman who had served in the hall longer than anyone could remember. "Men like Rurik don't protect serving girls out of kindness. They expect payment for their favors, and that payment always comes dear." "He's never asked anything of me," Brynhild protested, but even as she spoke the words, she wondered if she was being naive. The world she knew operated on simple exchanges: work for food, service for shelter, submission for survival. Kindness without expectation was so rare as to be almost incomprehensible. "Not yet," Helga replied ominously. "But they always do, child. They always do." These warnings troubled Brynhild more than she cared to admit. In the quiet hours before dawn, when she lay listening to the snores of her fellow servants, she found herself questioning Rurik's motives. Was she truly naive enough to believe that the most feared warrior in the settlement had intervened purely from nobility of spirit? Yet when she encountered him in the hall, when she saw the careful respect with which he acknowledged her presence, when she remembered the pain in his voice as he spoke of his lost sister, her doubts seemed foolish and unworthy. Whatever his reasons, his protection was real, and it had given her something precious, the first glimpse of what it might mean to live with dignity. The test of that protection came sooner than expected. It was during the third week after the feast that Magnus made his move. He had been watching, waiting for an opportunity when Rurik was absent from the hall, when Brynhild might be isolated and vulnerable. That opportunity presented itself on a grey morning when Rurik had ridden out with a hunting party, seeking fresh meat for the Jarl's table. Brynhild was alone in the storage room beneath the hall, counting sacks of grain and dried fish in preparation for the coming winter. The work required concentration and the ability to read and calculate skills that would have surprised many who assumed servants were incapable of such learning. She was absorbed in her task when she heard footsteps on the wooden stairs. "Well, well," came Magnus's voice from the doorway. The Jarl's little protected princess, all alone in the dark. Brynhild's blood chilled as she turned to face him. Magnus stood silhouetted against the light from above, his bulk blocking any hope of escape. His face wore an expression of cruel satisfaction that made her skin crawl with remembered fear. "My lord," she said carefully, setting down her counting stick and clay tablet. "I was just finishing the inventory. If you need something from storage, I can—" "Oh, I need something," Magnus interrupted, descending the steps with predatory slowness. "I need to finish a conversation we started a few weeks ago. You remember the one about respect and proper behavior?" "I remember," Brynhild said, backing toward the far wall as Magnus advanced. "And I remember that you apologized for your actions that night." "Apologized?" Magnus laughed harshly. "Is that what you call it? I was forced to humiliate myself before the entire hall because your protector decided to play hero. But Rurik isn't here now, is he?" The basement felt smaller with each step Magnus took toward her. The stone walls seemed to press inward, and the single oil lamp cast dancing shadows that made everything appear sinister and threatening. "He'll return," Brynhild said, trying to keep her voice steady. "And when he does, he'll find that his little pet has learned some manners." Magnus finished. "Don't worry, I won't leave marks where they'll show. I'm not completely stupid." Brynhild's hand closed around the handle of a small knife she used for opening grain sacks. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it was something. "Stay away from me," she warned. "Or what?" Magnus scoffed. "You'll cut me? A kitchen servant threatening a warrior? That's almost funny." He lunged forward, faster than his bulk suggested possible, but Brynhild had spent 3 years learning to anticipate and avoid trouble. She twisted aside, the knife flashing in a desperate arc that caught Magnus across the back of his hand. He howled in pain and rage, blood spattering the stone floor. "You little bitch, you actually cut me." "I warned you," Brynhild said, backing toward the stairs but finding her retreat blocked by Magnus's wounded bulk. "You're going to regret that," Magnus snarled, examining the shallow cut across his knuckles. "First I'm going to teach you respect, then I'm going to tell everyone how the mighty Rurik's protected servant attacked me without provocation." He advanced again, more carefully this time, and Brynhild knew that her small victory had only delayed the inevitable. In the confined space of the storage room, with no escape route available, she could not evade him indefinitely. But as Magnus reached for her, confident in his approaching triumph, the sound of footsteps echoed from the stairs above. "What's happening down there?" The voice belonged to Astrid, sharp with concern and authority. The older woman's footsteps echoed on the wooden stairs as she descended into the storage room, drawn by the sounds of struggle and Magnus's cry of pain. Magnus froze, his hand still extended toward Brynhild, blood dripping steadily from his wounded knuckles onto the stone floor. The arrival of a witness had complicated his plans significantly. Astrid commanded respect among the household staff and had the Jarl's ear when household matters required attention. "Just a small misunderstanding," Magnus said, forcing his voice into a semblance of casualness. The girl became startled and lashed out with a knife. "I'm sure she didn't mean any harm." Astrid's weathered eyes took in the scene with the quick assessment of someone who had survived decades by reading situations accurately. She saw Magnus's predatory stance, Brynhild's terrified expression, the blood on the floor, and the defensive way the young woman clutched her small blade. "Startled, was she?" Astrid said dryly. "Strange how often young women become startled when alone with certain warriors, almost as if they have reason to expect trouble." "Mind your tongue, old woman," Magnus warned, but his bravado rang hollow in the confines of the basement. "You're speaking to your betters." "My betters don't corner serving girls in storage rooms," Astrid replied without flinching. "My betters don't require young women to defend themselves with kitchen knives." Magnus's face darkened with rage, but before he could respond, another voice echoed from the stairs, this one deeper, carrying the unmistakable authority of birth and position. "Magnus, what are you doing down there?" Jarl Sindri himself appeared at the top of the stairs, his greying beard and rich clothes stark against the shadows of the basement. His presence transformed the situation instantly, from a private confrontation to a public matter requiring official attention. "My Jarl," Magnus said, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "I was checking on the winter stores when this servant attacked me without warning." He held up his bleeding hand as evidence. Sindri descended the stairs with the measured pace of a man accustomed to judging disputes. His keen eyes missed nothing: the confined space, the fear in Brynhild's posture, the way Astrid positioned herself protectively near the young woman. "Attacked you?" Sindri repeated, studying the minor wound on Magnus's hand. "That's quite an accusation. What prompted this alleged attack?" "I asked her to move aside so I could inspect the grain stores," Magnus said, his lie smooth and plausible. "She became hysterical and struck out with that knife." "Hysterical?" Sindri mused, his gaze shifting to Brynhild. "You don't look hysterical to me, child. You look frightened. There's a difference." Brynhild opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again. To contradict a warrior's word before the Jarl could mean severe punishment, but to remain silent felt like a betrayal of the courage Rurik had recognized in her. "Speak," Sindri commanded gently. "I would hear your version of these events." "My lord," Brynhild began, her voice trembling but growing stronger with each word, "Magnus cornered me down here. He spoke of finishing a conversation from the night of the feast, of teaching me manners. When he advanced on me despite my warnings to stay away, I defended myself." "Lies," Magnus exploded. "The word of a servant against a proven warrior. My Jarl, surely you won't." "I will hear all sides before making judgment," Sindri interrupted coldly. "That is my way, as you well know." He turned to Astrid. "You witnessed some of this?" "I heard sounds of struggle and came to investigate," Astrid replied carefully. "When I arrived, I found Magnus advancing on the girl while she defended herself with a small knife. The scene was not consistent with a simple misunderstanding over grain stores." Sindri nodded slowly, processing the conflicting accounts. His position required him to balance many competing interests: the loyalty of his warriors, the stability of his household, the complex web of honor and obligation that held their society together. "Magnus," he said finally, "you claim this was an unprovoked attack, yet I find you alone with a young woman in a confined space, bleeding from what appears to be a defensive wound. Either you are telling the truth and this servant is dangerously unstable, or you are lying to cover some shameful behavior." "My lord, I swear," Magnus began. "Furthermore," Sindri continued, "I recall another recent incident involving you and this same serving girl, an incident that required intervention from Rurik Oxheart himself. One might begin to see a pattern emerging." Magnus's face went pale as he realized the trap closing around him. His earlier humiliation had not been forgotten, and now it provided context that made his current protestations of innocence ring hollow. "Two incidents, involving the same people within a month's time," Sindri observed. "Both times the girl claims she was defending herself from your unwanted attention. Both times witnesses support her account over yours. What should I make of this pattern?" "Magnus?" The basement fell silent except for the steady drip of blood from Magnus's hand onto the stone floor. Everyone present understood that Sindri's next words would have consequences far beyond this immediate confrontation. "I think," Sindri said slowly, "that you have developed an unhealthy fixation on this servant. Whether born of injured pride or baser instincts, it has led you to behavior unbecoming a warrior in my service." "My Jarl, please," Magnus attempted. "I am not finished," Sindri said with quiet authority. "Your conduct brings shame not only on yourself, but on this household. You will stay away from this girl. You will not speak to her, approach her, or concern yourself with her duties in any way. Do I make myself clear?" Magnus's jaw worked soundlessly for a moment before he managed to speak. "Yes, my Jarl, but what of my wound? She drew blood." "In defense of her honor," Sindri replied firmly. "A defense that was apparently necessary due to your inappropriate behavior. Consider yourself fortunate that the matter ends here rather than requiring formal judgment." The dismissal was clear, but Magnus made no immediate move to leave. His eyes burned with humiliation and rage as he looked between Sindri and Brynhild, calculating whether further protest might serve his cause. "Go," Sindri commanded, and this time Magnus complied, pushing past them up the stairs with barely contained fury. When the sound of his footsteps had faded, Sindri turned his attention back to Brynhild. "You defended yourself well," he said approvingly. "But this matter is not finished. Magnus's pride has been wounded twice now, and wounded pride can fester into something dangerous." "I understand, my lord," Brynhild replied. "Do you?" Sindri asked. "I think perhaps you do not fully grasp what forces you have set in motion. Rurik's protection is powerful, but it cannot shield you from every danger. You must be more careful." As if summoned by the mention of his name, heavy footsteps echoed from above. Moments later, Rurik himself appeared at the top of the stairs, his hunting clothes still damp with morning dew, his pale eyes taking in the scene below with predatory intensity. "I heard there was trouble," he said simply. "Trouble that has been resolved," Sindri replied. "Though perhaps you should hear the details." As Astrid recounted the events in the storage room, Rurik's expression remained impassive, but something cold and terrible gathered in his pale eyes. When the tale was finished, he stood in silence for a long moment, processing the implications of what he had heard. "Where is Magnus now?" he asked finally. "Gone to tend his wound, I expect," Sindri replied. "I have forbidden him from approaching the girl again." "Good," Rurik said, "though I suspect words alone may not be sufficient to ensure his compliance." The threat implicit in his words hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. 3 days after the confrontation in the storage room, a messenger arrived at the settlement, bearing news that would change everything. He came at dawn, his horse lathered with sweat despite the cool morning air, and demanded immediate audience with Jarl Sindri on matters of utmost urgency. The man was travel-worn and hollow-eyed, bearing the marks of someone who had ridden hard through the night. His clothes were fine enough to suggest noble birth, but torn and stained by desperate travel. Most significantly, he wore the silver arm ring of Harald Bluetooth, the most powerful king in the northern territories. "My lord," the messenger gasped as he was brought before Sindra's throne, "I bear urgent word from King Harald. A great army marches on your lands. Eric Bloodaxe has allied with Saxon mercenaries and moves against you with 500 men." The announcement struck the hall like a thunderbolt. Eric Bloodaxe was the rival chieftain they had recently driven from the fishing grounds, but no one had expected such massive retaliation. 500 men represented a force large enough to overwhelm their settlement's defenses completely. "When?" Sindri demanded, his face grim with the weight of sudden crisis. "They will reach your borders within 2 days," the messenger replied. "King Harald sends word that he cannot spare troops to aid you. His own forces are committed elsewhere. You must evacuate or prepare for siege with what men you have." A murmur of dismay rippled through the assembled warriors. They numbered perhaps 60 fighting men, not nearly enough to face such overwhelming odds in open battle. The choice between evacuation and destruction seemed stark and unforgiving. "What does Harald counsel?" Sindri asked. "Flight, my lord," the messenger said bluntly. "Take your people and withdraw to his stronghold at Jelling. He will grant you sanctuary until this storm passes. And abandon everything we have built here." Bjorn the Bear Slayer spoke from his place near the throne. "Our homes, our fields, our ancestors' graves, that's no choice at all. Better homeless than dead," Gunnar One-Eye observed grimly. 500 men is not a force we can face with honor intact. As the warriors debated their impossible options, Rurik remained silent in his customary place by the pillar. His pale eyes were distant, focused on something beyond the immediate crisis that gripped the hall. When he finally spoke, his voice cut through the argument like a blade through silk. "There is another way." Every head turned toward him, hope and desperation mingling in their expressions. Rurik was known for tactical brilliance as much as personal prowess. If anyone could find a path through this disaster, it would be him. "Speak," Sindri commanded. Rurik stepped forward into the firelight, his massive frame casting long shadows across the floor. "Eric expects us to fight or flee. He doesn't expect treachery from within his own ranks. What do you mean? Sindra asked. I mean that Eric's Saxon allies are mercenaries, Rurik replied. They fight for gold, not loyalty. And mercenaries have a well-known weakness for better offers. Understanding began to dawn on the faces around him. Gunnar One Eye leaned forward with sudden interest. You're suggesting we turn his own men against him? More than that, Rurik said. I'm suggesting we give them a reason to betray him that goes beyond mere gold. What reason could be stronger than gold to a Saxon mercenary? Bjorn asked. Rurik's pale eyes found Brynhild where she stood among the other servants near the kitchen entrance. For a moment something unreadable passed across his features, calculation, resignation, perhaps even regret. Information, he said simply, information about Saxon settlements south of here that have grown fat and complacent. Towns that could be taken easily by men who knew their defenses and weaknesses. You know of such places? Sindra asked, surprise evident in his voice. I know of many things, Rurik replied cryptically, including the location of 3 Saxon merchant towns that store their winter wealth in poorly defended strongholds. Towns that a force of 200 experienced warriors could take with minimal losses. But how do we contact these mercenaries without alerting Eric to our intentions? Gunnar pressed. We don't contact them, Rurik said. We let them contact us. He moved to the wall where his great battle-axe hung and lifted it down with reverent care. The weapon seemed to pulse with malevolent life in the firelight, its runes glowing like fresh blood. I will go to them, he continued. Alone, under cover of darkness, I'll approach their camp carrying this. He hefted the axe meaningfully. Every mercenary in the Northern Territories knows this blade and the man who wields it. When I walk into their camp and offer to parley, they'll listen. You'd walk alone into an enemy camp? Bjorn protested. That's suicide, even for you. Not if I go as a defector, Rurik replied. Think about it. Rurik Oxheart, the famous berserker, seeking employment with the highest bidder. What mercenary captain wouldn't want to hear such an offer? The audacity of the plan was breathtaking. It required not just courage, but the kind of calculated deception that went against every principle of honorable warfare their culture revered. And if they don't believe you're truly defecting, Sindra asked. Then I'll convince them with something more valuable than words, Rurik said. I'll bring them proof of my sincerity, information about our defenses, our strengths and weaknesses, our plans for responding to their attack. You'd betray us truly. Magnus spoke for the first time since entering the hall, his wounded hand bound with linen. Give them real intelligence that could destroy us? I'd give them intelligence that appears real, Rurik corrected. False information carefully crafted to seem genuine. Let them think our defenses are weaker than they are, our numbers fewer, our resolve broken by fear. A dangerous game, Sindra mused. If you're discovered, if I'm discovered, I die, Rurik said simply. But if I succeed, we turn Eric's greatest advantage into his downfall. His mercenary allies become our weapon against him. As the implications of the plan sank in, a new voice spoke from the shadows near the servants' area. There's something else you should consider. Everyone turned in surprise to see Brynhild stepping forward, her face pale but determined. She had never spoken during a war council before, and her intervention violated every protocol of their society. Girl, this is not your place, Magnus snarled, but Sindra raised a hand for silence. Let her speak, the Jarl said quietly. These are desperate times, and wisdom can come from unexpected sources. Brynhild moved closer to the center of the hall, her hands clasped tightly before her to hide their trembling. Rurik's plan could work, she said, but only if the mercenaries truly believe he has reason to betray you. What do you mean? Rurik asked, though something in his expression suggested he already understood. I mean, they'll expect a man like you to have a powerful motivation for such treachery, Brynhild continued. Gold alone won't be enough, they'll suspect a trap, but if you had suffered some great humiliation here, some personal injury that demanded revenge. The hall fell silent, as the implications of her words became clear. Rurik nodded slowly, his pale eyes never leaving her face. "You're suggesting I claim to have been dishonored here," he said, "stripped of position or privilege in some way that would justify defection." "More than that," Brynhild said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I'm suggesting you take me with you." The collective gasp from the assembled warriors was audible. Even Sindre leaned forward in shock at such a suggestion. "Absolutely not," Rurik said immediately. "The plan is dangerous enough without." "Think about it," Brynhild pressed, overriding his objection with surprising force. "What would give you stronger motivation for betrayal than having your woman stolen by your Jarl? What would make mercenaries more likely to trust your defection than seeing you arrive with proof of the personal injury that drove you to it?" "She's right," Gunnar One Eye said slowly, understanding dawning on his scarred features. "Mercenaries understand betrayal born of personal grievance. They'd believe a man who claims his lord stole his woman." "It's too dangerous," Rurik protested. If the deception fails, we're all dead anyway," Brynhild replied. "But this way, we have a chance." Sindre stood from his throne, his face grave with the weight of decision. "The girl speaks wisdom," he said finally. "Harsh wisdom, but wisdom nonetheless. This addition to your plan, it could make the difference between success and failure." Rurik stood frozen for a long moment, his gaze fixed on Brynhild with an intensity that made the air between them seem to crackle. Finally he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "You understand what you're suggesting, the dangers you'd face?" "I understand," Brynhild replied. "And I understand that sometimes the only way to save what matters is to risk everything." The die was cast. Within hours, they would put their desperate gamble into motion. The afternoon sun hung low in the sky as preparations for the desperate gamble began in earnest. The great hall had transformed from a place of celebration into a war room, where every detail of their deception was planned with meticulous care. Maps were spread across tables, intelligence gathered, and false information carefully crafted to seem genuine enough to fool experienced mercenary commanders. Rurik stood apart from the planning circle, methodically checking his weapons and equipment. His great battle axe hung once more from his belt, but now it served a different purpose, not just as a tool of war, but as a symbol of his supposed treachery. Every mercenary in the northern territories would recognize that blade, and its presence would lend credibility to his fabricated defection. Near the kitchen entrance, Brynhild gathered what few possessions she could carry: a spare dress, her small eating knife, and a wooden comb her mother had left her. The meager collection fit easily into a small leather bag, a stark reminder of how little she had accumulated during her years of service. Yet as she prepared for the journey ahead, she felt neither fear nor regret, only a strange sense of purpose that surprised her with its intensity. Second thoughts. Astrid appeared beside her, the older woman's weathered face creased with worry. "It's not too late to speak against this madness. The men could find another way." "There is no other way," Brynhild replied quietly. "You heard the messenger. 500 men march against us. Without this deception, everyone in the settlement dies or flees with nothing." "Better to flee than to walk willingly into the lion's den," Astrid protested. "Child, you have no idea what kind of men those Saxon mercenaries are. They're not like our warriors, bound by honor and tradition. They're wolves in human form, caring nothing for anything save profit and pleasure." Brynhild paused in her packing to look directly at her friend. "I know what they are," she said softly. "Just as I know what I am, someone who has always hidden in shadows, afraid to act when action was needed. Not this time." Across the hall, Jarl Sindri worked with his war leaders to craft the false intelligence that Rurik would carry to the enemy camp. The information had to be carefully balanced, accurate enough to seem genuine, but flawed enough to give their true defenders crucial advantages when the battle came. "Tell them we have 43 fighting men, not 60. Sindri instructed his scribe. Make them think we're weaker than we are. And here, he pointed to a section of the settlement's defensive walls. Show this section as poorly maintained. In truth, we reinforced it last summer, but they won't know that. Gunnar One Eye studied the fake battle plans with a tactician's eye. What about our response to their attack? What story does Rurik tell about our preparations? Panic and despair, Sindri replied without hesitation. He tells them we plan to barricade ourselves in the hall and hope our walls hold long enough for Harald's reinforcements to arrive. Let them think we're passive victims waiting for slaughter. And if they ask about our store of weapons and armor, depleted by the recent raid against Eric's fishing camps, Sindri said, half our good blades damaged, our mail shirts in need of repair, paint us as an easy target for confident attackers. While the men worked on military deceptions, Brynhild found herself facing a different kind of preparation. To make their story convincing, she would need to look the part of a woman stolen from her protector by an unjust lord. That meant abandoning the simple servant's clothes she had worn for 3 years in favor of garments that suggested higher status. These belong to my daughter, Sindri said, presenting her with a bundle of fine cloth. She died of fever 2 winters past, but her memory lives on in these things. Wear them with honor. The dress was beautiful, deep blue wool, embroidered with silver thread, cut in the style favored by noblewomen. With it came a fine cloak lined with fox fur and soft leather boots that fit her feet like they had been crafted specifically for her. As Brynhild changed into these unfamiliar clothes, she caught sight of her reflection in a polished bronze mirror hanging near the women's quarters. The transformation was startling. Gone was the hunched, frightened servant girl, replaced by someone who looked confident, even regal. The fine clothes didn't just cover her body, they seemed to change her very nature. You look like a different person, Astrid observed, her voice thick with emotion. Like the woman you were always meant to be. Before Brynhild could respond, Rurik's voice called from the main hall. It's time. They gathered in the center of the hall, where torches cast dancing shadows across the assembled faces. Warriors, servants, children, and elders all had come to witness the departure of their unlikely champions. The weight of the settlement's survival rested on the shoulders of the most feared warrior among them and a kitchen servant who had never traveled beyond the nearest village. Rurik had shed his usual simple clothes in favor of his finest war gear. His mail shirt gleamed like scales in the torchlight, while his helmet bore the intricate metalwork that marked him as a warrior of exceptional skill and reputation. Yet it was his expression that drew attention, cold, controlled, but with an underlying intensity that suggested barely contained rage. Remember, Sindri said, addressing them both, you are not who you have been. From this moment until you return, you are Rurik the betrayer and his stolen woman. Everything depends on making that deception real. I understand, Rurik replied, his voice carrying the hard edge of a man driven by personal grievance. Even in preparation, he was already becoming the role he would play. Brynhild nodded her agreement, though her throat felt tight with suppressed emotion. The magnitude of what they were attempting was overwhelming, but there was no turning back now. The enemy camp lies half a day's ride to the north, Gunnar reported from his position near the maps. Our scouts report they've made no effort at concealment. They believe they hold all the advantages. Overconfidence, Rurik observed. We can use that against them. What if they don't believe your defection? His wounded hand remained bandaged, and his eyes held a mixture of resentment and grudging respect. What if they see through the deception immediately? Then we improvise, Rurik replied simply. And if improvisation fails, we die fighting. The blunt honesty of his answer sent a chill through the assembled group. Everyone present understood that this plan was their last hope. If it failed, nothing could save them from Eric Bloodaxe's revenge. As the final preparations concluded, Brynhild found herself approached by Magnus. The warrior's face was conflicted, as if he struggled with words that didn't want to be spoken. I owe you an apology, he said quietly, his voice pitched low enough that others couldn't hear. A real one this time. My behavior, it was unworthy. Thank you, Brynhild replied, surprised by the genuine regret in his voice. More than that, Magnus continued, I owe you respect. What you're doing tonight, walking into enemy territory to save people who've treated you poorly, that takes more courage than most warriors ever show. Before she could respond, he pressed something small and hard into her hand. Looking down, she saw a silver pendant, shaped like Thor's hammer, its surface worn smooth by years of handling. It belonged to my sister, Magnus said. She died young, like too many good people do. Keep it with you tonight. For luck. The gesture was so unexpected, so contrary to everything she thought she knew about Magnus, that Brynhild found herself speechless. She closed her fingers around the pendant and nodded her thanks. Time to go, Rurik announced, shouldering his pack and checking his weapons one final time. As they moved toward the great doors, the assembled crowd parted before them like water before the prow of a ship. Children reached out to touch Brynhild's fine cloak, while warriors clasped Rurik's shoulder in gestures of farewell and respect. At the threshold, Jarl Sindri himself waited with 2 horses, sturdy animals bred for endurance rather than speed. May the gods watch over you both, he said formally, and may you return with victory. We will return, Rurik replied with quiet certainty, one way or another. As they mounted their horses and rode out into the gathering dusk, Brynhild felt the weight of an entire settlement's hopes pressing down on her shoulders. Behind them, the familiar walls and buildings of the only home she had ever known grew smaller with each stride. Ahead lay the enemy camp and the most dangerous gamble of their lives. The moon was rising as they disappeared into the forest, 2 figures silhouetted against the star-scattered sky, carrying with them the fate of everyone they had left behind. The enemy camp sprawled across a broad meadow like a predator's lair, illuminated by dozens of fires that cast dancing shadows among the clustered tents and makeshift shelters. From their concealed position in the tree line, Rurik and Brynhild could see the full scope of the force arrayed against their home, hundreds of men moving between the fires, their voices carrying across the night air in a dozen different languages and accents. 500 seems an accurate count, Rurik murmured, his pale eyes cataloguing the camp's layout with professional interest. Perhaps more. Eric has gathered quite an army. Brynhild pulled her fox-fur cloak tighter against the chill night air, her fingers finding the silver pendant Magnus had given her. The weight of it in her palm provided an unexpected comfort as she studied the enemy camp with growing apprehension. How do we know which ones are the Saxon mercenaries? She asked quietly. Those, Rurik pointed toward a section of the camp where the tents were arranged in more organized rows. See how their fires burn in ordered lines? That's military discipline. Eric's Norse warriors camp more loosely, following clan groupings rather than tactical formations. As they watched, a group of men emerged from the Saxon section and made their way toward a large tent at the center of the camp. Even at distance, their bearing marked them as officers, men accustomed to command and confident in their authority. The leaders are meeting, Rurik observed. Perfect timing for uninvited guests. He began checking his weapons one final time, ensuring his great axe hung prominently at his side, where it would be immediately visible to anyone who challenged them. The blade seemed to drink in the moonlight, its runes appearing almost alive in the silvery glow. Remember, he said to Brynhild, you are my woman, stolen from me by Jarl Sindra's treachery. You hate him as much as I do, and you want revenge against those who wronged us both. Can you play that part convincingly? I can play it, Brynhild replied, though her voice trembled slightly. But what if they ask detailed questions about our relationship? What if they want proof that we're truly... Then we give them proof, Rurik said simply. He reached out and took her hand in his calloused fingers intertwining with hers. We act like people who care for each other. It shouldn't be difficult. The simple contact sent an unexpected warmth through Brynhild's chest. Despite the danger they faced, despite the desperate nature of their mission, she felt safer with Rurik's hand in hers than she had ever felt in her life. "Are you ready?" he asked. "No," she admitted honestly. "But that doesn't matter now, does it?" Rurik's mouth curved in what might have been a smile, spoken like a true warrior. They emerged from the tree line with deliberate boldness, making no attempt at stealth or concealment. Rurik rode slightly ahead, his posture radiating the controlled aggression of a man seeking confrontation, while Brynhild followed close beside him, her fine clothes and regal bearing, clearly marking her as someone of importance. The first challenge came quickly, a pair of sentries who stepped into their path with spears raised and harsh words in a mixture of Norse and Saxon tongues. Rurik reined in his horse and fixed them with the pale-eyed stare that had intimidated warriors across the northern territories. "I am Rurik Oxheart," he announced, his voice carrying clearly across the camp. "I seek parley with your commanders on matters of mutual profit." The effect of his name was immediate and electric. Both sentries stepped back involuntarily, their eyes fixed on the legendary battle-axe at his side. Around them, other warriors began to gather, drawn by the commotion and the incredible sight of the most feared berserker in the Northlands riding calmly into their camp. "Rurik Oxheart," one of the sentries stammered in accented Norse. "The Rurik Oxheart. What brings you here?" "Business," Rurik replied coldly. "The kind that's best discussed with men who have authority to make decisions. Take me to your leaders." The crowd around them grew larger as word spread through the camp like wildfire. Warriors pressed close to get a better look at the legendary figure, their faces showing mixtures of awe, fear, and calculation. Several pointed at his axe and whispered among themselves in tones of reverent terror. A new voice cut through the murmur of the crowd, deeper, more authoritative, speaking Saxon-accented Norse with the confidence of command. "I am Godwin the Bold, captain of King Edmund's mercenary company. What business could the famous Rurik Oxheart have with us?" The man who approached was clearly a veteran warrior, tall, broad-shouldered, with grey streaking his brown beard and scars crossing his weathered face. His eyes held the calculating intelligence of someone who had survived decades of warfare through careful judgment rather than reckless courage. "The kind of business that makes rich men richer," Rurik replied, dismounting from his horse with fluid grace, "and poor men wealthy beyond their dreams." Godwin's gaze shifted to Brynhild, taking in her fine clothes and obvious nobility. "And the lady? What role does she play in this mysterious business?" "She is the reason I'm here," Rurik said, helping Brynhild down from her horse with careful courtesy. "She is also proof of my sincerity." "Proof?" "Proof that I have been wronged by those I served," Rurik replied, his voice hardening with manufactured anger. "Proof that loyalty unrewarded becomes enmity eternal." Godwin studied them both for a long moment, his experienced eyes missing nothing: the quality of Brynhild's clothing, the genuine tension in Rurik's posture, the way they stood close together like people who had found comfort in shared grievance. "Interesting," he said finally. "Very interesting indeed. Perhaps we should continue this conversation somewhere more private." "My thoughts exactly," Rurik agreed. As they were led through the camp toward the commander's tent, Brynhild felt hundreds of eyes upon her. Some looks were merely curious. Others held darker intentions that made her grateful for Rurik's imposing presence at her side. She kept her chin raised and her expression proud, playing the part of a woman wronged but not broken. The command tent was larger than she had expected, easily capable of holding 20 men around a central table covered with maps and battle plans. Oil lamps provided warm light that revealed the faces of the mercenary leaders, hard men marked by years of professional warfare, their expressions skeptical but attentive. "Gentlemen," Godwin announced as they entered, "allow me to present Rurik Oxheart and his companion. They claim to have business that might interest us." The effect on the assembled officers was immediate. Several reached instinctively for their weapons before catching themselves, while others leaned forward with predatory interest. All had heard the stories of Rurik's legendary prowess, and none had expected to see him walk willingly into their midst. "Rurik Oxheart seeks new employment," Godwyn announced to his officers, the words hanging in the lamplit air like smoke from a sacrificial fire. "Claims he has information that might prove valuable to our enterprise." Eric Bloodaxe himself sat at the head of the table, his red beard braided with silver rings that caught the flickering light. His pale blue eyes fixed on Rurik with the intensity of a man who recognized both opportunity and danger in equal measure. "The great berserker comes to us willingly?" Eric's voice carried mockery edged with suspicion. "Forgive me if I find this difficult to believe. Last month you were driving my men from their rightful fishing grounds." "Last month I served Jarl Sindre faithfully," Rurik replied, his voice cold as winter iron. "Last month I believed loyalty was rewarded with loyalty. I have since learned otherwise." He placed his hand possessively on Brynhild's shoulder, the gesture both protective and intimate. "They took what was mine, claimed the right of lords to whatever pleased them, regardless of prior claim or affection." Brynhild felt the weight of every gaze in the tent upon her as she stepped slightly closer to Rurik, her chin raised defiantly. "Jarl Sindre desired a new bedwarmer," she said, her voice carrying bitter anger that was only partly feigned. "He cared nothing that I belonged to another, that my heart was given elsewhere." "And what did you do when your lord took your woman?" asked Olaf the Cruel, a scarred Saxon whose reputation for brutality was known across 3 kingdoms. "What could I do?" Rurik's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white with suppressed rage. "Challenge my sworn lord to combat, murder him in his hall like a common assassin. I am many things, but I am not oathbreaker or murderer of those who trust me. Instead, I came here," he continued, his pale eyes sweeping across the assembled commanders, "to men who understand that loyalty is a transaction, not a gift freely given to ungrateful masters." Eric leaned back in his carved chair, studying them both with calculating intelligence. "Pretty words," he observed, "but words are wind. What proof do you offer of this betrayal? What assurance do we have that this isn't some elaborate trap?" Rurik reached into his belt pouch and withdrew a roll of parchment bound with Sindra's personal seal. "Intelligence," he said simply, placing it on the table before Eric. "Complete details of Sindra's defenses, his numbers, his preparations for your attack." Eric broke the seal and unrolled the document, his eyes scanning the carefully crafted lies within. The false information painted a picture of panic and desperation, a settlement weakly defended and poorly prepared for siege. 43 fighting men? Eric looked up with predatory satisfaction. "He's weaker than I thought." "The recent raid cost him dearly," Rurik confirmed. "Half his weapons damaged, morale broken. He's barricaded himself in the hall like a frightened child, hoping Harold's reinforcements arrive before you do." "Reinforcements that aren't coming," Godwyn added with grim satisfaction. "Our spies confirm Harold's forces are committed elsewhere." As the mercenary commanders passed the false intelligence between them, discussing attack plans and dividing anticipated spoils, Brynhild played her part perfectly. She stood close to Rurik, one hand resting on his arm in a gesture of intimate support, her dark eyes blazing with manufactured hatred for those who had wronged them. "There's more," Rurik said, when the initial excitement had died down. "Information about Saxon settlements south of here, rich merchant towns with minimal defenses, storing winter wealth in poorly guarded strongholds." The Saxon officers leaned forward with sudden interest. This was the kind of intelligence that could transform a simple raid into a campaign of enrichment. 3 towns, Rurik continued, his voice taking on the tone of a man sharing valuable secrets. "Burnham, Wickford, and Ashford, each one ripe for taking by men who know their weaknesses." "And you know these weaknesses?" Olaf demanded. "I've raided south before," Rurik replied. "I know which gates are weakest, which guards can be bribed, which merchants keep their gold where it can be easily taken." For the next hour, he spun tales of southern riches and vulnerable targets, each story carefully crafted to appeal to mercenary greed, while painting him as an invaluable ally. The Saxon commanders hung on every word, their eyes bright with avarice. "Impressive," Eric admitted finally. "You offer much, Rurik Oxheart, but what do you want in return?" "Revenge," Rurik said simply. "I want to see Sindre's hall burning. I want him to know that his treachery cost him everything." "And gold," Brynhild added with convincing greed. "We want our share of whatever wealth you take from his stronghold." "Fair enough," Eric nodded approvingly. "But understand this: if you betray us, if this information proves false, you'll die slowly and painfully. Both of you." "Understood," Rurik replied without flinching, "though I think you'll find my intelligence quite accurate." The trap was set. Tomorrow, when Eric's forces attacked, they would find not the weak, demoralized defenders they expected, but a carefully prepared ambush. The Saxon mercenaries would discover their promised riches were bait in a snare that would cost them everything. As the meeting concluded and they were assigned quarters for the night, Brynhild felt the weight of their deception pressing down on her like stones. They had walked into the enemy camp and convinced seasoned warriors of their sincerity, but the hardest part still lay ahead. Tomorrow would bring battle, betrayal, and blood. Tonight, they could only wait and pray that their desperate gamble would save the people they had left behind. Dawn broke grey and cold over the enemy camp as Eric Bloodaxe's combined forces prepared for what they believed would be an easy victory. The Saxon mercenaries moved with professional efficiency, checking weapons and armor, while their Norse allies boasted loudly of the spoils they would claim. None suspected that their promised conquest would become their destruction. Rurik stood among them, his great axe gleaming in the morning light as he made final preparations for battle. To all observers, he appeared to be another eager warrior, anticipating the pleasures of war and plunder. Only Brynhild, watching from the tent where she had spent a sleepless night, could see the tension in his shoulders that spoke of a man preparing for the most dangerous gamble of his life. The attack began at midday, when the sun hung high enough to blind defenders looking east toward the approaching army. 500 men advanced across the open ground before Sindre's settlement, their confidence evident in their steady pace and loose formations. They expected token resistance at best, a few arrows from the walls before the defenders surrendered or fled. Instead, they found hell waiting for them. The first surprise came when they reached what their intelligence claimed was a weak section of the defensive wall. Instead of crumbling timber, they encountered freshly reinforced stone and iron spikes that channeled attackers into carefully prepared killing zones. Crossbow bolts flew from concealed positions, cutting down mercenaries who had expected to find frightened farmers cowering behind inadequate defenses. The second surprise was the number of defenders. Instead of 43 demoralized warriors, 60 seasoned fighters appeared on the walls, led by commanders who clearly knew exactly where the attack would focus. The false intelligence had become a weapon turned against those who trusted it. Rurik fought with calculated fury, his axe drinking deeply of Saxon blood, while he maneuvered gradually toward a predetermined position near the settlement's main gate. To the mercenaries around him, he appeared to be leading a fierce assault. In reality, he was positioning himself for the moment when the trap would spring completely shut. That moment came when Godwyn the Bold, frustrated by the unexpectedly strong resistance, ordered his reserves forward in a final push. As the Saxon mercenaries committed their full strength to what they thought would be the decisive assault, Rurik suddenly turned his legendary weapon against his supposed allies. The great axe that had terrorized enemies across the northern territories now swept through the ranks of men who had trusted its bearer. Rurik's war cry, "For Sindre! For home!" echoed across the battlefield as he carved a bloody path through the shocked mercenaries. The betrayal shattered Saxon morale completely. Men who had fought beside the legendary berserker moments before found themselves facing his terrible wrath, and many broke and ran rather than test themselves against his fury. The carefully planned assault dissolved into chaos as Eric Bloodaxe's forces realized they had been deceived from the beginning. From the settlement's walls, Sindre's archers poured arrows into the confused mass of attackers, while warriors sallied forth to strike at enemies who no longer knew friend from foe. The battle that was meant to be a massacre became a rout, with Eric's surviving forces fleeing across the countryside in desperate disorder. When the fighting ended and the last enemy had fled or fallen, a strange quiet settled over the blood-stained ground before the settlement. Bodies lay scattered like broken dolls, testament to the price of Eric Bloodaxe's ambition and the cost of underestimating those they sought to destroy. Rurik stood among the carnage, leaning heavily on his axe as exhaustion finally claimed him. Blood, most of it belonging to others, stained his mail and clothes, while his pale eyes held the distant look of a man who had seen too much death for one day. Brynhild found him there as the settlement's gates opened, and people streamed out to tend the wounded and count the cost of victory. She approached slowly, uncertain of her welcome now that the desperate masquerade was over. "It's finished," she said quietly. "Yes," Rurik replied, his voice hoarse from battle cries and exertion. "It's finished." For a moment they stood in silence. Two people who had shared an extraordinary experience that had changed them both in ways they were only beginning to understand. The kitchen servant and the legendary warrior roles that had once defined them completely, but now seemed distant and somehow inadequate. "What happens now?" Brynhild asked. Rurik looked at her for a long moment, seeing not the frightened girl who had served in Sindre's kitchens, but the woman who had walked willingly into enemy territory to save people who had shown her little kindness. The transformation was complete and irreversible. "Now," he said, reaching out to take her hand in his, "we decide who we want to be." Around them, the settlement celebrated its salvation with tears of relief and shouts of joy. Children who had faced the prospect of death or slavery ran free in the afternoon sunlight, while their parents began the work of rebuilding what the war had damaged. But for Rurik and Brynhild, walking hand in hand through the aftermath of their triumph, the future stretched out like an unwritten story. They had saved their home through courage and deception, had found strength in each other that neither possessed alone, and had discovered that sometimes the greatest victories come not from destroying enemies, but from becoming more than you ever thought possible. The legend of their desperate gamble would grow in the telling, inspiring other tales of unlikely heroes and impossible victories. But the simple truth of two people who chose to stand together against overwhelming odds, would always be more powerful than any legend. In the end, that was enough.